So, in the last sermon, Michal expressed disgust at her husband dancing nearly naked in front of the Ark of the Covenant as he joyfully led a procession from the rural hinterlands into the new city of Jerusalem. As she stood at the window looking down, she seethed at how David had treated her, and she questioned whether his real motives to move the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem were his love for God or his desire for power. Now, Ark of the Covenant, if you don't know, it's simply a rectangular box covered in gold with a top or a lid that's called the mercy seat. But the ark contained the 2 stone tablets that Moses brought down from the mountain and on which the 10 Commandments had been inscribed. That covenant, Ark of the Covenant, those 10 commands, they establish their relationship. I am your God and you are my people, and this is how thou shalt live. But here's what's really important to understand about it. The ark was where God lived. The people believed their God was portable. That wherever God went, wherever the ark went, God was present. And that's why they would literally carry it to the front lines of the battle so that God could be on their side. And to protect it, they had a tent that covered it. So, when David wanted the ark to reside in the new city, which would mean that God would reside in David's new city, the city of David. And again, Michal questioned his motives as she watched David dance in front of the procession as he led the ark into Jerusalem. And then it was sometime later that David thought, you know what? God needs a proper home. God is living in a tent while I live in this beautiful house of cedar. We should build a house for God. And he proposed his idea to the prophet Nathan, who said, you know, God loves you more than anybody else. So if that's what you want to do, well, go ahead and do it. But that night, Nathan had a dream. And in that dream, he heard God say, have I ever asked for anything better than a tent? I don't need anything better. Tell David I don't want a permanent structure. And later, God explained to David, I want to make my permanent home in you. Not in a house built of stone, but a living God through a line of descendants that, as Christians, we believe stretches all the way to Jesus and beyond. But nevertheless, David was determined to build a house for God anyway, which his son Solomon later expanded into this great and grand temple. So in the middle of all this, in between all these stories that come one after the other, is one story after another of violent bloodbath after violent bloodbath, and the casual reports of statistics are unnerving. For example, David killed 700 chariot drivers and 40,000 soldiers. You know, just another day at the office. But increasingly, peace and prosperity grew under the leadership of King David, so much so that 2 Samuel chapter 11, where Ben read, it begins by saying, in the spring of the year, when kings go off to war, David stayed behind. So the problem was he didn't quite know what to do with himself. And you picture him rambling around an immense mansion, perhaps in his slippers and robe. He's picking up objects and looking at them. It's flooded with memories. You know, a gold-covered candlestick from here, a beautiful gem from there. He was bored. His entire life had been filled with adventures, from his first days of chasing butterflies and protecting sheep from lions and bears, oh my, all the way to his first encounter with a giant named Goliath and then hiding from mad King Saul and his clandestine meetups with Jonathan to his most recent defeat of 40,000 Ammonites. He's wandering around his home, struggling with questions like, who am I if I'm not at work? Now, having too much time on your hands can be dangerous. And so it was that while he was looking for something to do, that he wandered out onto the roof of his palace and spotted a beautiful woman bathing on her roof. A righteous man would have quickly turned his head away, because bathing on the roof wouldn't have been unusual. It wasn't like they had an ensuite bathroom off the master bedroom. The roof was where someone could find some privacy. Privacy except, of course, from a leering king whose roof was higher than anyone else's. And David lusted for this woman and told his servants to find out who she was. And they informed him it was Bathsheba, the wife of one of his soldiers. The wife of should have been all he needed to hear. I mean, at the time, men could have multiple wives, but they couldn't have someone else's. Hey, David, read the 10 Commandments in that Ark of the Covenant, in that house you had built for God. David sent his servants to get her anyway, and then committed sexual assault. Now, these words might sound a little too strong, but just let's take a look at what happened. David summoned her. There's no way she could have said, no, thank you, I don't want to see the king. She was his subject. She had no rights, and he wanted her. And then, when she's there, there's no way she could have offered consent. Right? She was his subject. She had no rights, and he wanted her. So, enter the sexist biblical commentators and their excuses of boys will be boys. So-called scholars shame her and blame her. David sinned, but it was her fault. She instigated this sinful behavior of a virtuous man by seducing him. They say things like, it's obvious she should have been more careful about being seen while bathing. They literally call her vain, preening, self-absorbed, and desperate for attention. These are multiple commentaries. Someone called her a gold digger who wanted to entrap David to have his child so she could climb the social ladder. In 1951, there was a movie called David and Bathsheba, in which she supposedly flirted with him, and he told her he needed a woman who loved him as a man, not as a king, as though theirs was a great romance. Well, this sexual assault resulted in pregnancy. Powerful David thought he could cover up his crime. So David summoned Bathsheba's husband Uriah from the front lines. And surely he'd go straight home and have sex with his wife. And that way, any child born could be explained as Uriah's. But Uriah reasoned that he shouldn't enjoy the comforts of home and the companionship of his wife while his fellow soldiers were still fighting. So he stayed that night at the entrance to the palace with the servants. David's plans were foiled. So he brought him again the next night and dined with him and got him drunk. And now go home and sleep with your wife. But once again, he slept at the palace door because it wouldn't be fair to his fellow soldiers. And so David had no choice but to make sure that Uriah was accidentally killed on the battlefield. So David sent Uriah back with a letter to carry to his commander, carrying his own death sentence, that said to put Uriah right at the front. And sure enough, what David planned for happened. And upon Uriah's death, word was sent to David, and the commander feared that David would be furious. Instead, David replied, "Too bad, so sad. This is what happens in war, don't worry about it." Yeah, the words in the Bible are actually about that, about just like that. But his plan succeeded. And no one would ever find out the truth. So he thought. And you'll learn what happens next week. So after a suitable period of mourning, David summoned Bathsheba, and she became his 8th wife, although the exact number is kind of hard to determine. But here's the added bonus. So David looked like a hero for rescuing the poor widow of a lowly soldier from a life of poverty. Oh, all hail King David. So at Bible study on Thursday, we ask, is there any way to redeem this story? Right? Is there any good news in it at all? But not every story in the Bible or in life ends with, and the moral of the story is, and they all lived happily ever after. See, I have to give the Bible credit, or the people who compiled the Bible, for not skipping over this or many other stories that are even worse. And people might ask, why do you revere a book that has so much reprehensible content? Like any relationship, it's complicated. But what I can say is that the stories it tells about people are real. Those who compiled the Bible could have easily chosen just those stories that made David look heroic. But instead, we have this evidence of an incredibly flawed man. Just as flawed as we are. But David's example is that our hope is not found in perfection, but faithfulness. Can I remain faithful despite all these things that I have done? And does God remain faithful despite all these things I have done? One of my all-time favorite quotes is from Brian Stevenson, who works with people on death row. And he's often asked, why do you represent those people? Because we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. And this is not the end of the story for Bathsheba. Whatever her role with David or lack thereof, she is not solely a victim of assault. Despite being the 8th wife and there being other sons who could have been the heir to David's kingdom, you'll hear later how her son became David's unlikely successor, except for her clever intervention. In the entire genealogy of Jesus, there are only 4 women named, one of whom is Bathsheba. Well, actually, it's not her name. In the list, she's known as Uriah's wife, which kind of seems odd because it acknowledges, it highlights right in the middle of Jesus' genealogy that King David had her husband murdered after lusting for her from his rooftop and summoning her to his bedroom where she had no right to consent. Right in the middle of Jesus' family history. Yes, the Bible is complicated, but the stories of people within it are the stuff of real life. And that's precisely why it's redemptive, which means even the worst of what we have done can be used for good. Or perhaps more importantly, as Bathsheba demonstrated, even the worst of what has been done to us. Let me say that again. Even the worst of what has been done to us, we can use for good. And that, my friends, is very good news.